Get out of my house, you pathetic excuse for a mother. I'm embarrassed to even call you family." Those were the last words my daughter Vivienne screamed at me before slamming the door in my face, leaving me standing on the porch steps of the mansion I had secretly been paying the mortgage on for the past 8 years. What she didn't know was that in my worn leather purse I carried the documents to a $2.3 million trust fund I'd been building for her since she was born. By the time I walked back to my beat-up Honda that night, I'd already decided she'd never see a penny of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about money, it's about respect, gratitude, and what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. My name is Dorothy Clearwater, and for the past 15 years, I've been living what most people would call a double life. To my daughter Vivienne and her social circle in the affluent suburb of Rosewood Heights, I'm just the embarrassing mother who works as a night janitor at the local community college, drives a 12-year-old car, and shops at discount stores. What they don't know is that I own 3 rental properties in the next county, have an investment portfolio worth over $4 million, and could buy half the houses on Vivienne's street without blinking. You see, after my husband Richard died when Vivienne was just 8 years old, I made a choice that would define the next 2 decades of our lives. Instead of living off his substantial life insurance payout and the money from selling his successful accounting firm, I invested every penny and went back to work. I wanted Vivienne to grow up understanding the value of hard work, to be humble, to appreciate what she had. I thought if she saw me struggling, saw me working multiple jobs to make ends meet, she'd develop character. God, was I naive. The irony is almost laughable now. While I scrubbed floors at Millbrook Community College every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., my investment accounts were growing by tens of thousands each month. While Vivienne complained about our tiny 3-bedroom house in Elmwood Park, the modest neighborhood I'd deliberately chosen, I was collecting rent from 3 beautiful properties in Grandview Estates. While she rolled her eyes at my coupon clipping and secondhand shopping, I was quietly funding a trust account that would have made her one of the wealthiest young women in the county. I told myself I was being a good mother, I was teaching her values. I was making sure she didn't become one of those spoiled rich kids who never learn to appreciate anything. But somewhere along the way, my plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of becoming humble and hardworking, Vivienne became ashamed of me. Instead of learning to appreciate what she had, she learned to resent what she didn't have. By the time she graduated from Rosewood Heights University, which I paid for with a fake scholarship I created through my lawyer, she had developed a deep contempt for what she saw as our lower-class lifestyle. When she married Bradley Worthington III, heir to the Worthington pharmaceutical fortune, and moved into their sprawling estate on Platinum Ridge Drive, the distance between us became more than just geographical. She began treating me like a charity case, like a burden she had to endure out of obligation. "Mother, you really need to do something about your situation," she'd say during our increasingly rare visits, glancing around her marble foyer with obvious discomfort whenever I came to see my grandsons, 8-year-old Harrison and 6-year-old Preston. "It's just so embarrassing when the other mothers ask what you do for work." I'd bite my tongue and change the subject, always hoping that eventually she'd see past the surface, that she'd value our relationship more than appearances. I kept telling myself that her behavior was just a phase, that deep down, she was still the sweet little girl who used to help me bake cookies and plant flowers in our modest garden. But that illusion shattered completely 3 months ago. It started when Bradley's parents, Charles and Penelope Worthington, announced they were hosting their annual charity gala at the Rosewood Heights Country Club. It was the social event of the season, with a guest list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. Vivienne had been planning her outfit for months, desperate to make the perfect impression on her husband's family and their influential friends. 2 weeks before the gala, she called me in a panic. "Mother, I need you to watch the boys that night," she said, her voice tight with stress. "The babysitter canceled last minute, and I can't find anyone else who's available. I was exhausted from pulling 3 consecutive double shifts at the college. There had been a stomach bug going around, leaving us short-staffed, but of course I said yes. Despite everything, those grandsons of mine were the light of my life, and any time I could spend with them was precious. But then came the phone call that changed everything. "Actually, Mother," Vivienne said the day before the gala, her voice cold and distant, "I've made other arrangements. I realized it would be problematic if any of the Worthingtons' friends saw you here. You understand?" I stood in my small kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling like I'd been slapped. Problematic? Well, yes, I mean, look at yourself, look at your life. You're a janitor, Mother. You drive that horrible old car. You dress like… She paused, searching for the words that would cut deepest. Like someone from the wrong side of Millbrook. Bradley's parents are very particular about appearances, and I simply can't have you around their friends. That night, I sat in my little house in Elmwood Park, surrounded by the modest furniture and discount store decorations I'd deliberately chosen to maintain my facade, and I felt something shift inside me. For 15 years, I had sacrificed every comfort, every luxury, every indication of my true financial status, all to teach my daughter humility and gratitude. Instead, I had raised a daughter who was ashamed of the very values I thought I was instilling in her. But the worst was still to come. Last week, when I called to ask if I could take the boys to the new Science Museum in downtown Millbrook, Vivienne delivered the final blow that would change both our lives forever. "Actually, Mother, we need to talk." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Actually, Mother, we need to talk." Those 6 words hung in the air like a death sentence. I could hear the carefully practiced tone in Vivienne's voice, the same one she used when firing household staff or declining charity requests from organizations she deemed beneath her social status. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had just finished my morning shift at Millbrook Community College. I'd been covering for a colleague who was out sick, which meant I'd been awake for nearly 20 hours straight. All I wanted was to shower, grab a few hours of sleep, and maybe see my grandsons for dinner. Instead, I found myself driving the familiar route to Platinum Ridge Drive, my stomach churning with an inexplicable dread. The Worthington estate always made me feel small, which I now realize was probably intentional. The massive iron gates, the perfectly manicured lawn that probably cost more to maintain each month than most people's mortgage payments, the circular driveway lined with imported Italian marble. Everything about it screamed wealth and exclusivity. As I pulled my Honda up to the front entrance, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. My work uniform was wrinkled, my hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and exhaustion had etched deep lines around my eyes. I looked exactly like what I was pretending to be, a tired, working-class woman struggling to make ends meet. Vivienne answered the door before I could even knock, almost as if she'd been watching from the window. She was dressed in what I'd learned to recognize as her serious conversation outfit, a tailored cream-colored suit that probably cost more than I supposedly made in 3 months, paired with pearls that had belonged to Bradley's grandmother. "Come in, Mother," she said, stepping aside with the sort of measured politeness usually reserved for unwelcome solicitors. "We'll talk in the library." The library. Not the cozy sitting room where we'd shared tea during better times. Not the sunny breakfast nook, where the boys usually ambushed me with hugs and stories about school. The library was where Bradley conducted business meetings, where important decisions were made by important people. As we walked through the marble foyer, I caught a glimpse of Harrison and Preston playing in the garden with their nanny, a pleasant young woman named Claire, whom I'd grown quite fond of over the years. Harrison looked up and waved enthusiastically when he saw me through the French doors, but Vivienne quickly ushered me past before I could wave back. The library was every bit as intimidating as intended. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than functional. A massive oak desk dominated one corner, while expensive Persian rugs covered the polished hardwood floors. Vivienne gestured for me to sit in one of the smaller chairs facing the desk, while she positioned herself behind it. A power play so obvious it would have been laughable if it weren't so hurtful. "Mother," she began, her hands folded neatly on the desk's surface, "Bradley and I have been discussing your situation, and we've come to a decision." My heart started pounding. My situation? Your financial difficulties, your living conditions. The fact that you're working yourself into an early grave, just to scrape by. She spoke as if she were diagnosing a disease, clinical and detached. It's become clear that you're unable to maintain a lifestyle that's compatible with our family's position in the community. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. Compatible? Vivienne sighed, the same exaggerated sigh she'd used as a teenager when she thought I was being particularly dense. "Mother, last week at the country club, Patricia Worthington, Bradley's cousin, asked me point-blank why my mother drives a car that looks like it belongs in a junkyard. And when Mrs. Ashford from the charity committee mentioned seeing you emptying trash cans at the community college, I nearly died of embarrassment." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. "I've been working," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working to support myself, to be independent." "And that's admirable, really it is," Vivienne interrupted, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "But Mother, you have to understand the position you're putting us in. Bradley's father is being considered for the board of directors at Millbrook General Hospital. Bradley himself is up for partner at his law firm. We simply cannot have family members who are, how do I put this delicately, who reflect poorly on our social standing." I felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach. "What exactly are you saying, Vivienne?" She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the polished surface toward me. "We're saying we want to help you. We found a lovely assisted living facility about 2 hours north of here in Clearbrook Valley. It's very nice, very appropriate for someone in your circumstances. The monthly fees are quite reasonable, and Bradley and I are prepared to cover the costs." My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were glossy brochures for Sunset Manor, a community for active seniors. The photos showed smiling elderly people playing bingo, tending small gardens, and participating in what appeared to be arts and crafts activities. It looked pleasant enough, but the message was unmistakably clear. "You want to put me in a nursing home?" I asked, my voice hollow with disbelief. "It's not a nursing home, Mother, it's a retirement community. And it's not about putting you anywhere. It's about giving you the chance to live with dignity, surrounded by people your own age, people who understand your circumstances." Vivienne's voice took on the patronizing tone she used when explaining things to the boys. "You'll have your own small apartment, 3 meals a day, scheduled activities. You won't have to worry about working anymore, about struggling to pay bills, about maintaining that little house that's falling apart around your ears." I looked down at the brochures again, my vision blurring slightly. The facility was in Clearbrook Valley, a full 2-hour drive from Rosewood Heights. 2 hours from my grandsons, from the life I'd built, from the job I'd grown to love, despite my supposed reasons for taking it. "And if I don't want to go?" I asked. Vivienne's expression hardened. "Mother, be realistic. You're 62 years old, working a job that's destroying your health, living in a house that needs repairs you can't afford. How much longer do you think you can keep this up? What happens when you get sick or injured or simply too old to work? Do you expect us to drop everything and take care of you?" The cruel irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Here was my daughter, living in a mansion paid for partly by my carefully hidden investments, wearing jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by luxury that she'd never had to work a day to earn, lecturing me about realistic expectations and financial responsibility. "I need time to think about this," I managed to say. Vivienne's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course you do. But Mother, I need you to understand something. This isn't really a request. Bradley and I have already spoken to the administrator at Sunset Manor. There's an opening available next month. We think it would be best if you transition there as soon as possible." She stood up from behind the desk, smoothing down her skirt with practiced precision. "I'll give you until the end of the week to make arrangements. I'm sure once you see how lovely the facility is, you'll realize we're doing this out of love." As I walked back to my car on unsteady legs, clutching the folder of brochures that felt like a prison sentence, I heard Harrison calling my name from the garden. I turned to see him running toward the front gate, his face bright with excitement. "Grandma Dorothy, are you coming to my soccer game on Saturday? Coach says I might get to play midfielder." Vivienne appeared behind him almost instantly, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Harrison, Grandma is very busy. Run along back to Claire now." But Harrison persisted, the way only an 8-year-old can. "But Grandma, you promised you'd teach me how to make those chocolate chip cookies, like you used to make for Mommy when she was little." I saw something flicker across Vivienne's face, a moment of what might have been guilt or regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Harrison," I said, "run along." As I drove away from Platinum Ridge Drive, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, I realized that my daughter hadn't just asked me to move to an assisted living facility. She had told me to disappear from her life, to remove myself from her perfect world before I could embarrass her any further. That night, I sat in my small kitchen in Elmwood Park, staring at the brochures spread across my dining table. The same table where I'd helped Vivienne with her homework, where we'd played board games during rainy afternoons, where I'd comforted her through teenage heartbreaks and celebrated her achievements. Now she wanted to ship me off to Clearbrook Valley, 2 hours away from everything and everyone I loved, all because she was ashamed of the life I'd deliberately chosen to teach her humility. The ultimate irony was sitting in my safe deposit box at First National Bank of Millbrook, documents showing that I could buy Sunset Manor, along with half the properties in Clearbrook Valley, and still have money left over. But Vivienne didn't know that. And as I stared at those brochures, feeling the weight of her betrayal settle over me like a suffocating blanket, I began to wonder if it was time she found out exactly who she was trying to discard. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harrison's disappointed face when Vivienne cut short our conversation, heard the cold, clinical tone in my daughter's voice as she discussed shipping me off like an unwanted piece of furniture. By 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made myself a cup of coffee, sitting at my kitchen table with those damned brochures spread out before me like evidence of my own failure. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. I needed time to think, to process what was happening, to figure out how everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. Instead of heading to the community college, I drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Richard was buried. I'd always found clarity there, sitting by his headstone and talking through my problems as if he could still offer his quiet wisdom. "I really screwed this up, didn't I?" I whispered, tracing his name carved into the granite. "I thought I was teaching her values, Richard. I thought if she saw me struggle, she'd appreciate what she had, become a better person. Instead, I raised a daughter who's ashamed of everything I stand for." The wind rustled through the oak trees, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice telling me that it wasn't too late, that there had to be another way. But the rational part of my mind knew better. Vivienne was 31 years old, set in her ways, married into a family that valued appearance over substance. How could I possibly undo 15 years of careful deception without destroying everything? When I got home around noon, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. Vivienne's voice, crisp and businesslike. "Mother, I've scheduled an appointment for you to tour Sunset Manor this Friday at 2 p.m. I'll pick you up at 1:30. Please be ready. Not, would you like to see the facility, or when would be convenient for you? Just a command, delivered with the same tone she'd used to schedule a dental cleaning. I played the message 3 times, each replay making my chest tighten with a mixture of hurt and growing anger. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw Vivienne's name on the caller ID, but something made me pick up on the 4th ring. Mother, I know you're there. We need to discuss the arrangements for Friday. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Vivienne, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the one she used when she was trying to sound reasonable while getting her way. Mother, I understand this is difficult for you. Change is always hard, especially at your age. But you have to trust that Bradley and I know what's best here. At my age, the words came out sharper than I intended. Vivienne, I'm 62, not 92. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about where and how I want to live. Are you, though? The mask of patience slipped, revealing the condescension underneath. Mother, let's be honest about your situation. You're working a minimum wage job that's physically demanding for someone half your age. Your house needs a new roof, new plumbing, and God knows what else. Your car is on its last legs. You're one major expense away from complete financial ruin. Each word was like a dagger, especially because she was describing exactly the life I'd chosen to portray. The bitter irony was that while she lectured me about financial instability, my investment portfolio had earned more in the past month than she spent on her monthly shopping trips to the boutiques on Rosewood Avenue. I can take care of myself, I said quietly. Can you? Really? Vivienne's voice turned sharp. Mother, last month when you came to dinner, I noticed you were limping. When I asked about it, you brushed it off, said it was nothing. But I could see you were in pain. What happens when that gets worse? What happens when you fall down those stairs in that old house, or hurt your back lifting something at work, and there's no one there to help you? The concern in her voice might have been touching if I didn't know it was really about her own convenience. She wasn't worried about my well-being. She was worried about the potential inconvenience of having to deal with an elderly mother's problems while maintaining her perfect social image. Vivienne, I appreciate your concern, but… Do you? She interrupted. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're being stubborn and unrealistic. Bradley's parents are flying in next week for Preston's birthday party. Important people will be there. The mayor, several board members from the hospital, partners from Bradley's firm. I cannot have my mother showing up looking like… She paused, searching for the words that would cut deepest. Looking like the hired help. There it was. The real reason behind this sudden urgency to relocate me. Not love, not concern for my well-being, but embarrassment. Fear that my presence would somehow tarnish her carefully constructed image. So this is about Preston's birthday party? I asked, my voice barely controlled. This is about our family's reputation, Vivienne snapped. Do you have any idea how hard Bradley has worked to build his practice? How many years I've spent cultivating the right connections, joining the right committees, supporting the right causes. And now, just when everything is finally falling into place, I have to worry about whether my mother's going to show up in her janitor's uniform, driving that embarrassment of a car. I closed my eyes, feeling 15 years of sacrifice and pretense crashing down around me. I've never shown up anywhere in my work uniform, Vivienne. I've always dressed appropriately for family events. Appropriately? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mother, your idea of appropriate is a dress from Walmart and shoes from Payless. Do you know what the other women wear to these events? Do you have any concept of what's expected? I know exactly what's expected, I said, and for the first time in years I let a hint of steel creep into my voice. The question is whether I'm willing to meet those expectations. Vivienne must have heard something in my tone that gave her pause, because when she spoke again, her voice had shifted back to the false sweetness she used when she was trying to manipulate someone. Mother, I know this seems harsh, but we're trying to help you. The truth is, you can't keep living this way. It's not sustainable, and it's not fair to any of us. Preston and Harrison are getting older, and they're starting to ask questions about why Grandma Dorothy works cleaning buildings while their other grandmother lives in a mansion and travels to Europe twice a year. The mention of my grandsons was a calculated blow, and it hit its mark. I thought about Harrison's excited chatter about his soccer game, about Preston's shy smile when he showed me his artwork, about all the moments I'd miss if I were locked away in Clearbrook Valley. "What questions?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Harrison asked Bradley last week why you couldn't just live with us, why you had to work so hard when we have plenty of room and money. And Preston," she paused dramatically, "Preston told his teacher that his grandma is poor and has to clean toilets for a living. Do you understand how mortifying that was? The teacher called me in for a conference because she was concerned about Preston's understanding of social dynamics." Each word was carefully chosen for maximum impact, designed to make me feel like I was somehow damaging my grandsons by existing in their lives as I was. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting, but it was also effective. Because despite everything, despite the hurt and anger building inside me, I did love those boys more than anything in the world. "Maybe," Vivienne continued, pressing her advantage, "if you were settled somewhere nice, somewhere age-appropriate, you could focus on being their grandmother instead of working yourself to death. You could have quality time with them without the stress of your current situation affecting every interaction." Quality time. As if the hours I spent reading them stories, helping with homework, and listening to their dreams were somehow diminished by my supposed financial struggles. As if love and attention were less valuable when they came from someone who appeared to clean toilets for a living. "I need more time to think about this," I said finally. "Mother, we don't have time. The opening at Sunset Manor won't wait forever, and frankly, facilities like that don't often have availability. This is an opportunity, not just a solution to a problem." "An opportunity," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. "Yes, an opportunity to live with dignity, to stop struggling, to let your family take care of you for a change instead of being a constant source of worry," and she caught herself before finishing the sentence, but I knew what she'd been about to say. "Embarrassment. I was a constant source of worry and embarrassment." "Vivienne," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me, "what if I told you that my financial situation isn't what you think it is? What if I told you that I'm not actually struggling, that I'm not poor, that I've been deliberately living modestly for reasons you don't understand?" There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with the kind of patronizing concern usually reserved for people experiencing delusions. "Mother, I understand that it's hard to accept help, especially when you've been independent for so long, but denial isn't going to change your circumstances. I've seen your house, I've seen your car, I know what you make at that job. There's no shame in admitting that you need assistance." She didn't believe me. Even faced with a direct hint about my true situation, she was so convinced of my poverty, so invested in her narrative of the struggling mother who needed to be managed and contained, that she couldn't even consider the possibility that she might be wrong. "I'll see you Friday at 1:30, she said before I could respond. "And Mother, please try to approach this with an open mind. We really are trying to do what's best for everyone." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The woman I'd just spoken to bore little resemblance to the daughter I'd raised, the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared, who brought me dandelions she'd picked from the yard because she thought they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I opened my laptop and logged into my investment accounts, watching the numbers scroll across the screen. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate investments, all carefully managed and grown over the years, while I maintained my facade of financial struggle. The irony was staggering. While my daughter planned to ship me off to an assisted living facility because she was embarrassed by my supposed poverty, my net worth was probably higher than that of half the people she was so desperate to impress at the country club. As I scrolled through the account summaries, one particular document caught my eye: the trust fund I'd established for Vivienne when she was born. Over 31 years, it had grown from the initial $50,000 to over $2.3 million. I'd planned to give it to her on her 35th birthday, along with the revelation about my true financial status. I'd imagined her surprise, her gratitude, her understanding of why I'd made the choices I had. Now, staring at those numbers while her cruel words echoed in my memory, I began to wonder if she deserved to inherit anything at all. Friday was still 3 days away. I had until then to decide whether to continue this charade, to allow myself to be shuttled off to Clearbrook Valley like an inconvenient piece of furniture, or to finally reveal the truth about who I really was. For the first time since this nightmare began, I found myself smiling, because Vivienne had no idea what kind of fight she'd just picked. Friday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the ice forming around my heart. I'd spent the previous 2 days in a strange state of clarity, making preparations that Vivienne would never see coming. I'd contacted my financial advisor, my lawyer, and made several other calls that would have shocked my daughter had she known about them. But first, I had to endure this charade of touring the assisted living facility, this final humiliation she was determined to put me through. At exactly 1:30 p.m., I heard the distinctive purr of Vivienne's Mercedes pulling into my driveway. Through my living room window, I watched her check her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting her perfectly styled blonde hair and reapplying lipstick. She was dressed in what I'd come to recognize as her "I'm doing charity work" outfit. Expensive but not flashy, designer but understated, the kind of ensemble that whispered wealth while maintaining an air of noble sacrifice. I opened the door before she could ring the bell, stepping out in the same navy blue dress I'd worn to church last Sunday. It was clean, pressed, and perfectly respectable, but I could see her eyes rake over it with barely concealed disappointment. No doubt she'd hoped I'd show up in something more obviously shabby to reinforce her narrative about my desperate circumstances. "Ready to go, Mother?" she asked, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "I think you're really going to love Sunset Manor. The administrator, Mrs. Patterson, has been so helpful in explaining all their programs and amenities." The drive to Clearbrook Valley passed intense silence, broken only by Vivienne's periodic comments about the scenery or updates about Harrison's soccer practice and Preston's art class. She spoke about my grandsons as if they were casual acquaintances rather than my beloved family members, and each mention felt like another small knife twisting in my chest. Sunset Manor was exactly what I'd expected from the brochures: pleasant, well-maintained, and utterly soul-crushing in its cheerful mediocrity. The building was a sprawling single-story complex painted in muted pastels, surrounded by carefully manicured gardens and walking paths that seemed designed more for containment than enjoyment. A large sign proclaimed, "Sunset Manor, where life begins again," a slogan so patronizing it made my teeth ache. Mrs. Patterson met us in the lobby, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She wore a burgundy blazer with a name tag that identified her as Director of Resident Services, and everything about her screamed professional competence, wrapped around a core of complete disinterest in the actual humans she was paid to manage. "Mrs. Clearwater, how wonderful to finally meet you," she gushed, extending a manicured hand. "Your daughter has told me so much about your situation. I'm confident we can provide exactly the kind of supportive environment you need." My situation. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person making a life choice. The tour began in what Mrs. Patterson called the community living areas, a series of beige rooms filled with overstuffed furniture and the kind of inoffensive artwork found in hotel lobbies. Elderly residents sat in small clusters, some playing cards, others watching television with the volume turned up loud enough to accommodate failing hearing. Everyone moved slowly, spoke quietly, and seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation that they were calling retirement. "As you can see, our residents really enjoy socializing," Mrs. Patterson chirped, gesturing toward a group of women working on a jigsaw puzzle featuring kittens in a basket. "We have organized activities every day. Bingo on Mondays, craft time on Wednesdays, movie nights on Fridays. There's never a dull moment." I watched Vivienne nod approvingly, as if she were touring a luxury resort rather than inspecting a warehouse for discarded parents. She asked questions about meal plans, medical care, and visiting policies, with the detached interest of someone researching boarding schools for a problematic child. "And speaking of visiting," Mrs. Patterson continued, leading us down a hallway lined with identical doors, "we find that our residents adjust better when family visits are structured. We recommend limiting visits to once a month for the first 6 months to help with the transition process." Once a month. She was talking about rationing my time with my grandsons like it was medicine to be carefully measured and dispensed. "That sounds very reasonable," Vivienne said quickly before I could respond. "We want to make sure Mother settles in without any unnecessary disruptions." Unnecessary disruptions. That's what my relationship with Harrison and Preston had become in her mind. Unnecessary disruptions to her perfect life and my enforced exile. The apartment they showed me was small but adequate. A living room, kitchenette, bedroom, and bathroom decorated in the same aggressively neutral palette as the rest of the facility. The windows looked out onto the courtyard where residents walked in slow circles, like well-dressed prisoners taking their daily exercise. "The monthly fee covers everything," Mrs. Patterson explained, handing me a folder thick with forms and agreements. "Rent, utilities, 3 meals a day, housekeeping service, and access to all our activities and amenities. Your daughter mentioned that finances might be a concern, but we do have payment assistance programs for qualifying residents." Payment assistance programs. They were talking about charity, about subsidizing my care because they believed I was too poor to afford their services. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe around it. "What's the monthly cost?" I asked, though I already knew from the brochures. "For a 1-bedroom apartment like this one, it's $3,200 per month," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But as I mentioned, we have options for those who need financial assistance." I did some quick mental math. The monthly cost was less than what I earned in dividend payments from just one of my smaller investment accounts. I could afford to buy the entire facility without significantly impacting my net worth, yet here they were discussing payment plans and charity programs. "And of course," Vivienne added, "Bradley and I are prepared to help with the expenses. We want to make sure you're comfortable and well cared for." Help with the expenses. My daughter, living in a mansion partially funded by my hidden wealth, was offering to help pay for my exile to an assisted living facility I could buy with pocket change. After the tour, Mrs. Patterson led us back to her office to discuss next steps. The room was decorated with motivational posters featuring sunsets and inspirational quotes about new beginnings and embracing change. Behind her desk hung a plaque that read, "Home is where the heart is," which seemed particularly cruel given that she made her living convincing people to abandon their actual homes. "I have the admission paperwork right here," she said, spreading several forms across her desk. "If you decide to move forward, we can have you settled in within 2 weeks. The October 1st move-in date would be perfect timing. You'd be here for our Halloween festivities and our Thanksgiving celebration with families." Halloween festivities and Thanksgiving celebration with families. They were already planning my holiday schedule, already assuming I'd given up my real life for this beige existence of supervised socialization and structured visits. Vivienne leaned forward eagerly. "What do you think, Mother? Doesn't this seem like exactly what you need?" What I needed. Not what I wanted. Not what would make me happy. But what she had decided I needed, based on her embarrassment and convenience. I looked around the office, taking in the motivational posters, the bland furniture, the carefully controlled environment designed to make elderly people feel grateful for being warehoused. I thought about my grandsons, probably at home with their nanny, wondering why Grandma Dorothy couldn't come to Harrison's soccer game or help Preston with his art project. I thought about my job at the community college, where I'd built genuine friendships with my colleagues and found real satisfaction in keeping the facilities clean and welcoming for students who reminded me daily that learning and growth didn't stop at any particular age. Most of all, I thought about the $2.3 million trust fund sitting in an account that my daughter didn't even know existed, growing larger every month, while she planned to ship me off to Clearbrook Valley so I wouldn't embarrass her in front of her country club friends. "Mrs. Patterson," I said quietly, "could I have a few minutes alone with my daughter to discuss this privately?" "Of course," she said, gathering up the paperwork. "Take all the time you need. I'll be right outside if you have any questions." After she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click, Vivienne turned to me with expectant eyes. "Well, I think it's perfect, don't you? You'll have everything you need, no more worrying about money or maintaining that old house, and we'll know you're safe and well cared for." Safe and well cared for, and conveniently located 2 hours away from her perfect life. "Vivienne," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're asking me to do." "I'm not asking, Mother. I'm offering you a solution to a problem that's only going to get worse if we ignore it. The problem being that I embarrass you." She had the grace to look uncomfortable for a moment, but it passed quickly. "The problem being that you're living in circumstances that are beneath what a woman your age should have to endure. You're working yourself to death, living in a house that's falling apart, driving a car that's one breakdown away from leaving you stranded. This is a chance for you to live with dignity." Dignity. She kept using that word as if there were something inherently undignified about work, about independence, about choosing to live modestly. As if dignity could only be found in supervised recreation and structured meal times and monthly visits rationed out like precious resources. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mother, be realistic. What's your alternative? Keep working until you collapse? Keep pretending that you can maintain your independence when we both know you can't? And what about Harrison and Preston? Do you really want them to remember their grandmother as the woman who was too stubborn to accept help when she needed it?" There it was again, using my grandsons as weapons, threatening to keep them away from me if I didn't comply with her plans. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost insulting. "What I want," I said, standing up from my chair, "is for you to understand exactly who you're trying to discard." Something in my tone must have warned her, because her expression shifted from smug confidence to uncertainty. "What do you mean?" I walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard, where elderly residents moved in their careful circles, and I made the decision that would change both our lives forever. "I mean, Vivienne, that you've made a terrible mistake. You've assumed that because I work as a janitor and drive an old car and live in a modest house, I must be poor and helpless and in need of your charity. You've decided that I'm an embarrassment to your perfect life, a problem to be solved by shipping me off where your country club friends won't have to see me." I turned back to face her, and for the first time in 15 years, I let her see the real me, not the struggling single mother I'd been pretending to be, but the woman who had built a financial empire while scrubbing floors at night. "But what you don't know, what you've never bothered to find out, is that I'm not poor, Vivienne. I'm not helpless, and I'm certainly not in need of your charity." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that while you've been planning my exile to this place, I've been sitting on investments worth over $4 million. I'm talking about the fact that I could buy this entire facility and turn it into a parking lot without affecting my financial security. And, most importantly, I'm talking about the $2.3 million trust fund I've been building for you since the day you were born. Money you'll never see now because you've shown me exactly what kind of person you really are." The silence that followed was deafening, Vivienne stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, her perfect composure cracking like ice in spring. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it? Mrs. Patterson is expecting an answer about my admission here. Let me give you one. I wouldn't live in this place if it were the last building on earth. I'm going home now. To my house, that I own free and clear. To my job that I love. To my life that I chose. And you, Vivienne, are going to have to find another grandmother for your boys, because I'm done being treated like an embarrassment by my own daughter." I walked to the door and opened it, then turned back for one final look at the woman I'd spent 31 years loving and 15 years trying to teach humility. "Congratulations," I said quietly. "You just lost a mother and a fortune in the same afternoon." The drive home from Clearbrook Valley was the longest 2 hours of my life. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as the weight of what I'd just done crashed over me like a tidal wave. I'd burned every bridge, revealed every secret, and essentially declared war on my own daughter. There would be no taking it back, no pretending it was all a misunderstanding born of stress and hurt feelings. But as the miles passed and my heart rate slowly returned to normal, I found myself feeling something I hadn't experienced in 15 years: freedom. The crushing weight of maintaining my facade, of carefully monitoring every purchase, every word, every action to maintain the illusion of financial struggle, was finally gone. For better or worse, the truth was out. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for several minutes, looking at my modest house with new eyes, the peeling paint on the shutters that I deliberately ignored to maintain appearances, the overgrown flower beds that I'd neglected because a struggling janitor wouldn't have time or money for landscaping, the old mailbox that I'd refused to replace because it fit the image I was trying to project. All of it suddenly felt like props in a play that had finally reached its final curtain. I was barely through my front door when the phone started ringing. I knew without looking at the caller ID that it would be Vivienne, probably calling from the parking lot of Sunset Manor, demanding explanations, accusations, threats. I let it ring, then ring again, and again. By the time the answering machine picked up for the 4th time, I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "Mother, pick up the phone. We need to talk about this immediately. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this isn't funny. Call me back right now." Game. Even faced with the truth, she thought I was playing some kind of elaborate joke. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive in its completeness. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the modest furnishings I'd chosen so carefully to support my deception. The generic brand coffee, the discount store placemats, the second-hand toaster that worked perfectly well but looked appropriately shabby. Every item had been selected to reinforce the narrative of Dorothy Clearwater, struggling single mother and minimum wage worker. The phone rang again. This time I answered. "I'm here, Vivienne." "Mother!" Her voice was shrill with panic and anger. "What the hell was that back there? Are you having some kind of breakdown? Mrs. Patterson thinks you might be experiencing dementia or a psychological episode." Of course she did. It was easier to believe that I was mentally ill than to accept that her entire understanding of our relationship had been built on lies. Lies that I had told, but lies nonetheless. "I'm perfectly sane, Vivienne. I told you the truth." "The truth?" She laughed, but it sounded forced and brittle. "Mother, you work as a janitor. You live in a house that needs thousands of dollars in repairs. You drive a car from 2011. What truth are you talking about?" "The truth about why I made those choices. The truth about the money your father left us. The truth about what I've been building for you all these years while you've been too embarrassed by my existence to see past the surface." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less disbelieving. "You're saying you've been pretending to be poor? For 15 years? "I'm saying I chose to live modestly while investing wisely. There's a difference." "But why? Why would you do something so insane?" The hurt in her voice was real, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct to comfort her, to explain, to make everything better. But then I remembered her words from the past week, her casual cruelty, her willingness to ship me off to Clearbrook Valley like an unwanted piece of furniture. Because I wanted you to understand the value of work, of humility, of treating people with respect regardless of their financial status. I wanted you to become a person who wouldn't look down on someone just because they cleaned toilets or drove an old car. So this is my fault? Her voice was rising again. You lied to me for 15 years. Let me worry about you. Let me think you were struggling, and somehow this is about my character. You weren't worried about me, Vivienne. You were embarrassed by me. There's a difference. Of course I was worried. Do you think I enjoyed watching you work yourself to death? Do you think it was easy for me to see you living in that little house, driving that terrible car, working a job that was clearly too physically demanding for someone your age? The words sounded sincere, but I'd heard too much in the past week to buy into them completely. If you were so worried, why didn't you offer to help me before now? Why didn't you invite me to live with you, or offer to supplement my income, or at least include me in your life instead of hiding me from your friends? Silence. Vivienne, I'm asking you why, if you were so concerned about my welfare, you waited until you had an important social event coming up to suddenly decide I needed to be relocated. That's not how it happened. Isn't it? You told me yourself that you couldn't have me around when the Worthingtons' friends came to Preston's party. You said I would be problematic, that I would reflect poorly on your social standing. Those were your exact words. I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to feel uncomfortable around people who might not understand your situation. Even now, even faced with the truth about my financial status, she couldn't admit what she'd really meant. She couldn't say the words, I was ashamed of you. My situation, I repeated. You mean my choice to work an honest job and live within my means? Mother, please, can we start over? I made some mistakes, said some things I didn't mean. If what you're saying is true, if you really do have money, then obviously we need to have a different conversation. And there it was, the moment her perception of my value shifted based on my perceived net worth. Not an apology for her cruelty, not recognition that she'd been wrong to treat me the way she had, but a calculation that she needed to recalibrate our relationship now that she knew I wasn't poor. A different conversation, I said slowly. You mean now that you know I'm not the broke embarrassment you thought I was, you're willing to treat me with respect? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her mind racing, trying to find the right words to fix this situation, to put the genie back in the bottle and restore her access to a fortune she'd never known existed. I meant that I love you, and I want to understand what's been happening. I want to fix this. Fix this, I repeated. By doing what, exactly? By talking, by working through this together, by being a family again. Being a family again. As if we'd ever been a real family in her mind. As if she hadn't spent the past week treating me like a burden to be managed and contained. Vivienne, let me ask you something. If I were still the poor janitor you thought I was an hour ago, would you still want to be a family again? Would you still be calling me, desperate to work things out? Or would you be at home right now, telling Bradley what a terrible scene I made at the assisted living facility and planning how to minimize the damage to your reputation? The silence that followed was answer enough. I thought so, I said quietly. Mother, that's not fair. Yes, I made mistakes, but… Mistakes? The word came out sharper than I intended. Vivienne, you spent a week trying to convince me that I was too poor, too old, too embarrassing to be part of your life. You wanted to ship me off to a facility 2 hours away and limit my visits with my grandsons to once a month. You lectured me about dignity while planning to exile me because I embarrassed you in front of your country club friends. Those weren't mistakes. Those were choices. I was trying to help. You were trying to solve a problem, the problem being me, my existence in your perfectly curated life. I could hear her crying now, soft hiccuping sobs that might have moved me a week ago, but I'd learned too much about who my daughter really was to be swayed by tears. "What about Harrison and Preston?" she asked finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you really going to punish them for my mistakes? They love you, Mother. They need their grandmother." And there it was again, using my grandsons as weapons, as leverage to get what she wanted. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still trying to manipulate me. "I love those boys more than life itself," I said. "But I won't be used as an occasional convenience for them while being treated as an embarrassment to you. Either I'm family or I'm not, Vivienne. You can't have it both ways." "So what are you saying? You're going to cut us out of your life completely?" "I'm saying that our relationship as it was is over. If you want something different, something real, you're going to have to prove that you've learned something from this experience. And that starts with acknowledging what you did wrong, not just the fact that your plan backfired." I acknowledge that I handled things poorly." "Handled things poorly," I repeated. "Is that really the best you can do?" There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mother. I want you to say what you actually think and feel, not what you think I want to hear. I want you to be honest about why you really wanted me in that assisted living facility. I want you to admit that this was never about my welfare or my dignity. It was about your convenience and your image." The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of careful deception and a week of brutal honesty. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her struggling with the choice between continued manipulation and genuine accountability. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was ashamed of you, not because of who you are, but because of how you lived. I was ashamed to have a mother who worked as a janitor when all my friends' mothers were doctors and lawyers and socialites. I was ashamed of your car, your clothes, your house. I was ashamed, and I wanted you hidden away where I wouldn't have to deal with that shame anymore." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge, not to forgiveness, not yet, but to the possibility of something honest and real. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for finally telling me the truth." "So what happens now?" she asked. I looked around my kitchen, at the life I'd built on a foundation of lies told with the best of intentions, and I realized I didn't have an answer to that question. Not yet. "Now," I said, "I figure out who I really am when I'm not pretending to be someone else. And you figure out if you can love the real me as much as you hated the fake one." The week that followed my confrontation with Vivienne was unlike anything I'd experienced in 15 years. For the first time since Richard's death, I woke up each morning without the weight of maintaining a carefully constructed lie. I didn't have to check my appearance to make sure I looked appropriately struggling, didn't have to avoid certain stores or restaurants, because they might contradict my image of financial hardship. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But freedom, I discovered, could also be profoundly lonely. I'd built my entire social world around my role as Dorothy the janitor, Dorothy the struggling single mother, Dorothy who clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. My colleagues at the community college knew me as someone who worked extra shifts to make ends meet. My neighbors in Elmwood Park saw me as the woman who mowed her own lawn because she couldn't afford a service. Even my few casual friendships were built on the foundation of shared financial struggles and modest lifestyles. Now, sitting in my kitchen with my laptop open to investment accounts showing numbers that most of these people would never see in their lifetimes, I felt like an imposter in my own life. Who was Dorothy Clearwater when she wasn't pretending to be poor? Who was I when I stripped away the costume I'd worn for so long it had become a second skin? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tuesday morning, as I sat on my front porch with my coffee, trying to decide whether to go to work or call in sick again, my neighbor Clara Martinez approached with her usual warm smile. Clara was 73, a retired teacher who lived in the small house next to mine with her elderly cat Mischief. We'd shared casual conversations over the fence for years, mostly about gardening and the weather, but nothing particularly deep or personal. "Dorothy, honey," she said, settling into the old rocking chair I kept on the porch for visitors, "you've seemed troubled lately. Everything okay?" I looked at this woman who'd been my neighbor for over a decade, who'd brought me soup when I had the flu and who'd helped me carry groceries when my car was in the shop, and I realized she was the first person to ask me how I was doing since my world had exploded. Not because of what I could do for them, not because they needed something from me, but simply because she cared. "Clara," I said slowly, "what would you say if I told you that everything you think you know about me is a lie?" She studied my face with the kind of careful attention that only came from decades of reading the emotions of struggling students. "I'd say that people usually have good reasons for the lies they tell, especially lies they tell about themselves." Something about her matter-of-fact acceptance broke open a dam I didn't even know I'd built. Before I knew it, I was telling her everything. About Richard's death, about the life insurance money, about my decision to live modestly while building Vivienne's future. About the investments, the rental properties, the trust fund that would never see the light of day. About Vivienne's shame, her ultimatum, and the confrontation that had shattered our relationship. Clara listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, gently rocking in the old chair while Mischief wound around her ankles. "You know," she said finally, "I taught middle school for 42 years. You want to know what I learned about kids in all that time?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I learned that you can't teach someone to value something by hiding it from them. You can't teach humility by pretending to be humble while secretly being proud. And you can't teach respect for working people by pretending to be something you're not." Her words hit me like a physical blow, but she wasn't finished. "But I also learned that sometimes the best lessons come from the worst mistakes. Your daughter learned something from this experience, Dorothy. Maybe not what you intended to teach her, but something important nonetheless. And so did you." "What did I learn?" I asked. "You learned that money doesn't define you, but neither does the lack of it. You learned that respect can't be bought or faked. It has to be earned through authenticity. And you learned that you're strong enough to walk away from people who don't value you, even when those people are your own family." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, feeling simultaneously devastated and relieved. "I don't know who I am anymore, Clara. For 15 years I've been playing a role. Now that the play is over, I don't know what comes next." "Then maybe it's time to find out," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to stop being who you thought you should be and start being who you actually are." That afternoon, Clara invited me to join her weekly book club. It was a small group of women who met every Thursday evening at the Millbrook Public Library, and according to Clara, they were always looking for new members. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for social things." "Dorothy," Clara said firmly, "these women don't care what you do for work or what kind of car you drive. Half of them are retired teachers living on pensions, and the other half are working women trying to make ends meet. They care about whether you've read the book and whether you can make a decent pot of coffee when it's your turn to host." Thursday evening found me walking into the library's community room, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and a copy of the month's selection, a novel about women's friendships during World War II. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since high school, unsure of how to introduce myself or what version of my story to tell. The women gathered around the table ranged in age from 50 to 80, and their warm welcome immediately put me at ease. There was Janet, a retired nurse who'd raised 4 children as a single mother. Susan, who worked part-time at the local flower shop and wrote poetry in her spare time. Marie, whose husband had died young, leaving her to run his small plumbing business for the past 20 years. And Patricia, a former librarian who'd traveled the world on a shoestring budget and had stories that could fill several books. As we discussed the novel, its themes of sacrifice, friendship, and the difficult choices women make for their families, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. When Susan mentioned how hard it was to balance caring for aging parents with maintaining your own life, I talked about my struggles with Vivienne without revealing the full financial picture. When Marie shared her experience of being underestimated because of her working-class background, I found myself nodding in recognition. "You know what I love about this book?" Janet said as we finished our discussion. "It's about women who found strength they didn't know they had when everything they thought they knew about their lives fell apart." The words resonated so deeply I felt them in my bones. After the meeting, as we cleaned up and prepared to leave, Patricia pulled me aside. "Dorothy, I hope you'll come back next week. It's refreshing to have someone new in the group, especially someone who clearly understands that books are meant to be lived, not just read." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. Walking to my car, I realized something had shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I'd spent an evening being myself. Not Dorothy the janitor, not Dorothy the struggling mother, not Dorothy the secret millionaire, but just Dorothy, a woman who read books, baked cookies, and had something valuable to contribute to a conversation about literature and life. The next day, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I called my supervisor at the community college and requested a meeting. "Dorothy," Bill Henderson said when I walked into his office Friday afternoon, "I have to say, you've seemed different this week. Everything okay?" Bill was a good man, probably 10 years younger than me, who'd taken over the facilities management department 3 years ago. He'd always treated me with respect and kindness, and I'd grown to consider him a friend rather than just a boss. "Bill," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to tell you something that's going to sound pretty strange." Over the next hour, I gave him a condensed version of my story. I didn't mention the specific amounts of money involved, but I explained that I'd been living far below my means for personal reasons that no longer applied, and that I wanted to make some changes to my employment situation. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said when I finished. "You're telling me that you've been working the night shift as a janitor by choice, not because you needed the money?" "That's right." "And now you want to, what, quit?" "Actually, no. I want to stay, but I want to change my role. I've been thinking about this all week, and I realize that I love working here. I love being part of the college community, helping to maintain a space where people come to learn and grow. But I want to do it on my own terms now." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, containing a proposal I'd spent the previous evening writing. "I'd like to transition from janitorial staff to a consulting role. I want to help improve the facilities, maybe work on some of the maintenance projects that have been put off due to budget constraints. I'm prepared to volunteer my time for most of it, but I'd like to maintain a small official role so I can keep my benefits and my connection to the college." Bill stared at the proposal, then looked up at me with something like amazement. "Dorothy, some of these ideas, the green energy initiatives, the accessibility improvements, the student study spaces, these would transform the campus. But the cost would be covered by private donation," I said, "anonymous private donation." He was quiet for a long moment, processing this new version of the woman he'd known for years as a dedicated but financially struggling employee. "You know," he said finally, "I always wondered how someone with your insights and ideas ended up working night shifts for minimum wage. This explains a lot." "I hope it doesn't change how you see me," I said. "I'm still the same person." "Are you?" he asked, not unkindly, because the Dorothy I knew was competent and hardworking, but she was also smaller somehow, quieter, like she was trying not to take up too much space. "The woman sitting in my office right now is different. She's bigger, more confident. She's not apologizing for existing." His words hit me like a revelation. He was right. For 15 years, I'd been making myself smaller, dimming my own light to fit the role I'd created. I'd apologized for my presence, downplayed my ideas, and accepted less than I deserved because I was afraid that asking for more might break my cover. I think, I said slowly, I'm finally figuring out who I really am. Well, Bill said with a grin, I like her already. When can we start? That evening, I sat on my front porch again, but this time, I wasn't alone. Clara had brought over a bottle of wine and her photo albums, and we spent the evening looking at pictures from her travels and talking about dreams deferred and second chances. You know what's funny? I said as the sun set over Elmwood Park. For years, I thought I was sacrificing my comfort to teach Vivienne values. But I think I was really just hiding from myself. Hiding from the responsibility that comes with having money. Hiding from the judgment of others. Hiding from the fear that I wasn't enough without the struggle to define me. And now? Clara asked. I looked around at my modest neighborhood, at my small house that I could now renovate or replace, at the life I could now live openly and authentically, and I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Now I think I'm ready to find out what Dorothy Clearwater can do when she stops pretending to be someone else. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Vivienne, I was standing in the renovated conference room at Millbrook Community College, presenting my campus improvement proposal to the Board of Trustees. The transformation in my own confidence was as dramatic as the changes I was proposing for the college. Gone was the apologetic posture I'd maintained for 15 years, replaced by the assured presence of a woman who finally understood her own worth. The accessibility improvements alone will benefit over 200 students with mobility challenges, I explained, clicking through the presentation I'd spent days perfecting. But more importantly, these changes will signal that Millbrook Community College is committed to being truly inclusive, not just meeting minimum legal requirements. Board member Dr. Elizabeth Thornton leaned forward with interest. Mrs. Clearwater, these proposals are remarkably comprehensive. May I ask about your background in facilities planning and disability services? The question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. For years, I'd hidden my true capabilities, my education, my natural talent for seeing systems and improving them. Now, for the first time, I could answer honestly. I have a bachelor's degree in business administration from State University, which I completed before my husband's death. I've spent the last 15 years observing this campus from a unique perspective. As someone who's been in every building, every classroom, every storage closet, I've seen how the current systems work and where they fail, particularly for our most vulnerable students. What I didn't mention was that during those 15 years of observation, I'd also been quietly auditing online courses in urban planning, accessibility design, and nonprofit management. Knowledge I'd gained purely for my own satisfaction, never imagining I'd have the opportunity to use it. The board voted unanimously to approve the pilot program, with Dr. Thornton personally thanking me afterward. It's refreshing to see someone with such passion for institutional improvement, she said. I hope you'll consider applying for our next board opening. We need more voices like yours. Board member. The suggestion would have terrified the old Dorothy, the one who spent her life trying to remain invisible. The new Dorothy found herself genuinely excited by the possibility. That evening, I celebrated my victory at the book club's monthly dinner gathering. What had started as a simple literary discussion group had evolved into something deeper, a circle of women who supported each other through life's challenges and celebrated each other's victories. I'm so proud of you, Janet said, raising her glass of wine. Do you realize what you've accomplished? You've essentially redesigned an entire campus based on 15 years of careful observation and genuine care for students. That's not luck or coincidence. That's expertise. Expertise, another word I'd never allowed myself to claim. I'd spent so many years minimizing my contributions, deflecting credit, and apologizing for taking up space, that the idea of being genuinely skilled at something felt foreign. You know what I love about your story? Susan added, cutting into the lasagna Marie had brought. It's not just about money or social status. It's about finally owning who you really are. I've been watching you these past few weeks, and you're literally becoming more yourself with each passing day. Patricia nodded enthusiastically. Remember that first night you came to book club? You sat in the corner, barely spoke above a whisper, apologized for every comment you made. Tonight, you presented to a board of trustees and convinced them to fund a $250,000 improvement project. That's not just confidence, that's transformation. Their words meant more to me than they could possibly know. These women had known me only in my authentic state, had never seen the carefully constructed facade I'd maintained for my family and former social circle. Their validation carried a weight that Vivienne's approval never had, because it was based on truth rather than performance. Speaking of transformation, Clara said with a mischievous smile, I have some news that might interest you. My niece Rosa works at the Millbrook Gazette, and she mentioned they're looking for community members to join their editorial advisory board. Apparently, they want voices that represent different perspectives on local issues. The newspaper? I asked, intrigued despite myself. Think about it, Marie said. You've got insights into the college, the working community, the challenges facing older residents. Plus, you've got the time and financial freedom to actually attend meetings and contribute meaningfully. The suggestion sparked something in me I hadn't felt in decades: ambition. Not the desperate, grasping kind that seeks validation through status, but the healthy kind that wants to contribute, to make a difference, to use accumulated wisdom for good. 2 days later, I found myself in another conference room, this time at the Millbrook Gazette offices, interviewing for the advisory board position. Rosa Martinez, Clara's niece and a sharp journalist in her 30s, led the discussion along with editor-in-chief Michael Walsh. We're particularly interested in your perspective on economic inequality in the community, Rosa said, referring to the application I'd submitted. You mentioned having experience with both financial struggle and stability. Can you elaborate on that? I'd crafted my application carefully, being truthful about my current financial security while acknowledging my years of living modestly. It was a delicate balance, honest without being sensational, informative without being boastful. I've had the unique experience of living as both a working-class single mother and as someone with financial resources, I said. What I've learned is that the challenges facing our community aren't always about the amount of money available, but about how that money is distributed and who gets to make decisions about its use. Michael leaned forward. Can you give us a specific example? Absolutely. At the community college, I've seen students drop out not because they couldn't afford tuition, but because they couldn't afford the ancillary costs: transportation, childcare, even basic school supplies. Meanwhile, the college has been sitting on funds allocated for, quote, student services that could easily address these issues if someone took the time to understand what students actually need. And you think you could help bridge that gap? Rosa asked. I think I could help ensure that the newspaper covers these issues with the depth and nuance they deserve. Too often, poverty gets discussed in abstract terms by people who've never experienced it. I can offer a perspective that's both informed by lived experience and grounded in practical solutions. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from local housing policy to business development strategies. By the end, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced since my early career days, before marriage and motherhood had redirected my ambitions. Mrs. Clearwater, Michael said as we wrapped up, I have to ask, what changed? Your references describe someone who's been quietly working in the background for years, but the woman sitting here today seems ready to step into a much more visible role. It was a fair question and one I'd been asking myself. I spent 15 years trying to be invisible, I said honestly. I thought invisibility was a virtue, that keeping my head down and not making waves was somehow noble. But I've learned that invisibility is often just another form of selfishness. If you have knowledge, resources, or perspective that could help others, keeping quiet about it doesn't make you humble. It makes you complicit in maintaining the status quo. A week later, I received the call confirming my appointment to the advisory board. My first assignment was to write a monthly column about community issues from what Rosa called the perspective of lived experience. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of hiding my true circumstances, I was being asked to share my insights about economic mobility and community development. But the validation that meant the most came from an unexpected source. I was leaving the grocery store on a Saturday morning when I heard someone call my name. Turning, I saw Jennifer Walsh, one of the younger janitors from the college, someone I'd mentored informally during my night shifts. "Mrs. Dorothy," she called, jogging over with her 2 young children in tow. "I heard about your new position with the college board. That's amazing!" "Thank you, Jennifer. How are the kids?" "They're great, thanks to that scholarship program you helped set up. Marcus starts at the community college next fall." She paused, studying my face. "You know, I always wondered about you." "Wondered what?" "Well, you always knew so much about everything. Not just cleaning, but business stuff, education stuff, how to talk to administrators and make them listen. Some of us used to joke that you were probably some kind of undercover boss or something," she laughed. "Turns out we weren't that far off, were we?" Her words hit me with unexpected force. Even while I'd been trying to hide my true capabilities, they'd been visible to people who worked alongside me. I'd thought I was successfully playing a role, but in reality, I'd simply been suppressing parts of myself that couldn't be completely contained. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "I hope my transition doesn't change how you see me. I'm still the same person." She shook her head. "No, you're not. You're better. You're like yourself, but more so. You know what I mean?" I did know. For the first time in 15 years, I was becoming fully myself, not diminished by deception, not constrained by false limitations, not apologizing for taking up space in the world. That evening, I sat in my study, a room I'd finally begun using for its intended purpose rather than treating it as expensive storage, and opened my laptop to write my first newspaper column. The cursor blinked on a blank page as I considered how to begin. Finally, I started typing. 15 years ago, I made a choice that I thought would teach my daughter humility. Instead, it taught me something far more valuable, that hiding your light doesn't make others shine brighter. It just makes the world a little darker for everyone. As the words flowed onto the page, I realized that for the first time in decades, I wasn't writing as someone playing a role or trying to prove a point. I was writing as Dorothy Clearwater, not the struggling janitor, not the secret millionaire, but the woman who had finally learned that authenticity was the only foundation worth building a life on. The column would run in next week's paper, and with it, my emergence into the fully realized version of myself that had been waiting patiently for 15 years to finally see the light of day. 6 weeks had passed since my revelation at Sunset Manor, and I was beginning to understand that having money wasn't just about financial security. It was about having options, influence, and the power to create change. For the first time in my adult life, I was wielding that power deliberately and strategically. My first newspaper column had generated more response than anyone expected. The Millbrook Gazette's phone lines buzzed for days with calls from readers who'd connected with my perspective on economic mobility and community development. But it was the email that landed in my inbox on a Wednesday morning that would change everything. "Mrs. Clearwater," it read, "my name is attorney Rebecca Sterling from Sterling & Associates. I represent a coalition of local business owners and community leaders who were impressed by your recent column. We'd like to discuss a matter that might interest you. Could we arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience?" I'd heard of Rebecca Sterling. She was known throughout Millbrook as a fierce advocate for women's rights and economic justice. Her firm represented everyone from small business owners fighting zoning battles to women seeking divorce settlements from wealthy husbands. The fact that she wanted to meet with me felt significant. 2 days later, I sat in her downtown office, a converted Victorian house that had been transformed into a warm but professional space. Rebecca was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of sharp intelligence that made you sit up straighter in your chair. "Dorothy," she said, offering me coffee from an expensive-looking machine, "I'm going to be direct with you. We know who you are." My heart skipped a beat. "I'm not sure what you mean." "We know you're not just the former janitor turned community advocate. We know about your investment portfolio, your rental properties, your financial resources." She settled back in her chair, studying my reaction. "The question is, what do you plan to do with that knowledge?" I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also oddly relieved. "How did you find out?" "This is a small community, Dorothy. When someone goes from working night shifts to funding $250,000 campus improvements, while simultaneously joining editorial boards and writing insightful columns about economic policy, people notice." My colleague James Peterson handles real estate transactions. He's been tracking some interesting property purchases and improvements in Grandview Estates that trace back to shell companies registered in your name. She wasn't accusing me of anything wrong, but the implication was clear. My financial activities had left a paper trail that observant people could follow. "What do you want?" I asked. "We want to offer you an opportunity to do something meaningful with your resources. There's a development project threatening to destroy the Riverside neighborhood. You know, the area where most of our service workers and immigrant families live. The developer, Harrison Blackstone, is using tactics that are technically legal but morally reprehensible." She slid a thick folder across her desk. "Blackstone Industries has been systematically buying up properties, raising rents to force out longtime residents, then claiming the area is quote, blighted and needs to be raised for luxury condos. 37 families will be displaced, including 15 with children under 10. I opened the folder, scanning through property records, rent increase notices, and photographs of families packing their belongings. My chest tightened as I recognized several faces. Jennifer Walsh's elderly neighbor, the young mother who always brought her toddler to the community college's free lunch program, the maintenance worker who'd helped me move supplies during my janitor days. "What can I do about it?" I asked. "More than you might think. Blackstone's plan depends on acquiring a few key properties to complete his land assembly. If he can't get those properties, the whole project becomes financially unfeasible." Rebecca pointed to a highlighted section of the documents. 3 of those properties are currently for sale, and 2 others are facing foreclosure. If someone with sufficient resources were to purchase them and hold them, the development would be blocked, I finished. "Exactly. But it would take someone with both the financial means and the legal knowledge to navigate Blackstone's inevitable challenges. Someone like you, working with someone like me." I studied the documents more carefully, my mind racing through calculations. The 5 properties would cost approximately $800,000 total, a significant sum, but well within my means. The legal fees and holding costs would add perhaps another $100,000 over the next few years, less than a third of what I'd planned to give Vivienne in her trust fund. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "This isn't just about blocking one development. Blackstone Industries has similar projects planned for 3 other neighborhoods in Millbrook. If we can stop him here, establish a precedent, we can potentially save hundreds of families from displacement. And if I say no, then 37 families lose their homes so that Harrison Blackstone can build luxury condos for people who already have more housing options than they need." She leaned forward. "Dorothy, I've been fighting these battles for 20 years, usually with clients who have more passion than resources. For once, I have the chance to work with someone who has both." I closed the folder, my decision already made. "What do we need to do first?" Rebecca smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her since I'd walked into her office. "First, we move fast. Blackstone doesn't know yet that someone with your resources is paying attention to his project. We have maybe 2 weeks before he realizes what's happening and starts taking countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" "Legal challenges, political pressure, media campaigns designed to paint us as obstructionists, standing in the way of progress. He's done this before in other cities." He's very good at making himself look like the victim while bulldozing through communities. Over the next hour, Rebecca outlined a strategy that was both legally sound and tactically brilliant. We would form a nonprofit organization focused on affordable housing preservation, using my resources to purchase the key properties while building a coalition of community supporters. The nonprofit structure would provide legal protection while also creating opportunities for tax advantages and grant funding. "I have to ask," Rebecca said as we wrapped up our meeting, "what made you decide to step forward like this? Most people with your level of wealth prefer to stay in the background, maybe write a check to charity, but avoid getting directly involved in messy local politics." I thought about Vivienne, about 15 years of hiding, about all the opportunities I'd missed to use my resources for good because I was too invested in maintaining a false image. "I spent too many years making myself small," I said. "I convinced myself that invisibility was a virtue, that keeping quiet was somehow noble. But I've learned that when you have the power to help and you choose not to use it, you're not being humble, you're being complicit." That evening, I called an emergency meeting of my book club. I needed their advice, their perspective, and their support for what I was about to undertake. Clara, Janet, Susan, Marie, and Patricia gathered in my living room, the first time I'd hosted them in my home, another small step toward authenticity. "I need to tell you all something," I began, then laid out the full story of my financial situation and the opportunity Rebecca had presented. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Janet spoke. "Dorothy, do you realize what you're talking about? You're essentially declaring war on one of the most powerful developers in the region. This Harrison Blackstone has connections to the mayor's office, the city council, probably half the business community." "She's right," Marie added. "I've seen what happens to people who cross Blackstone. Remember the Martinez family who tried to fight his parking garage project downtown? They ended up with code violations, tax audits, and harassment that went on for 2 years." But Susan was nodding thoughtfully. "On the other hand, how many times have we sat around this table complaining about gentrification, about how working families are being pushed out of neighborhoods they've lived in for generations? Dorothy has the chance to actually do something about it." Patricia, who'd been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke. "The question isn't whether it's risky. Of course it's risky. The question is whether it's right, and whether Dorothy is prepared for what comes next." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that once you do this, there's no going back to being invisible. You'll be a public figure, a target, someone whose every move gets scrutinized. Are you ready for that level of exposure?" I looked around the room at these women who'd become my closest friends, my chosen family, in a way that my biological family had never been. Their concern was genuine, their warnings valid. Taking on Blackstone Industries would indeed change my life irrevocably. "6 weeks ago," I said finally, "my daughter tried to ship me off to an assisted living facility because she was embarrassed by who she thought I was. I've spent 15 years hiding my true capabilities, my resources, my potential impact on the world. I'm tired of being afraid of my own power." Clara reached over and squeezed my hand. "Then we'll help you. Whatever you need, research, moral support, connections in the community, we're with you." "You don't even know what you're signing up for," I warned. "Neither do you," Janet said with a grin. "But that's never stopped any of us before." 3 days later, I sat in Rebecca's office again, this time signing incorporation papers for the Millbrook Community Preservation Foundation. As I wrote my name on document after document, transferring nearly $1 million from my investment accounts to fund our first major initiative, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the weight and exhilaration of wielding real power for a cause I believed in. "Harrison Blackstone has no idea what's about to hit him," Rebecca said as we finished the paperwork. "Good," I replied. "It's time he learned that not everyone can be bought, intimidated, or ignored." By the end of the week, we'd purchased 4 of the 5 critical properties, with offers pending on the last one. The Riverside neighborhood was safe, at least for now. But as Rebecca had warned, our victory would come at a cost. Blackstone Industries would not take this defeat quietly, and I was about to learn just how far powerful men would go to punish women who dared to stand in their way. Harrison Blackstone's retaliation began exactly 1 week after we secured the final property in Riverside. I should have expected it, but the speed and viciousness of his response caught even Rebecca off guard. It started with a seemingly innocent phone call on a Tuesday morning. I was in my study reviewing architectural plans for converting one of the Riverside properties into a community center when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably familiar. Mother. Vivienne's tone was different, not the desperate pleading I'd heard after our confrontation at Sunset Manor, but something colder, more calculated. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 2 months, and hearing her voice sent an unexpected jolt through my chest. Vivienne, I said carefully, this is unexpected. I'm sure it is. I'm calling because I've been having some very interesting conversations lately. It seems my mother has become quite the local celebrity. There was something in her voice that made my stomach clench. What do you mean? I mean that Harrison Blackstone came to see me yesterday, at my home. Can you imagine my surprise when one of the most powerful men in Millbrook showed up at my door asking questions about my mother's finances? The words hit me like ice water. I'd known Blackstone would fight back, but I hadn't considered that he might use my family against me. What did he want? He wanted to know where a former janitor suddenly acquired the resources to purchase nearly $1 million worth of real estate. He seemed to think I might have some insights into your transformation. I could hear the careful control in her voice, the way she was measuring each word. And what did you tell him? I told him the truth, Mother. I told him about your little deception, about the money you've been hiding all these years, about the trust fund you claimed I'd never see. Her voice grew sharper. I told him everything. The betrayal hit me harder than I'd expected. Even after everything that had happened between us, some part of me had hoped that Vivienne might eventually understand, might even be proud of what I was trying to accomplish. Instead, she'd weaponized my secrets against me. Why? I asked quietly. Because you humiliated me, Mother. Because you made me look like a fool, in front of everyone who matters in this community. Did you think I'd just accept that? Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for destroying my life? I didn't destroy your life, Vivienne. I revealed my own. Same thing, she snapped. Do you have any idea what the past 2 months have been like for me? People asking questions, making assumptions, treating me like some kind of charity case, who didn't even know her own mother was wealthy? Bradley's parents are questioning whether they want to be associated with our family anymore. His law firm is reconsidering his partnership track. All because you decided to play your little games with the truth. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. In my focus on confronting Vivienne's treatment of me, I hadn't fully considered how my revelation might affect her standing in the social circles she valued so highly. I'm sorry you've been affected by this, I said. But Vivienne, what I'm doing now... What you're doing now is making enemies of people who could destroy you, she interrupted. Harrison Blackstone isn't just some local developer, Mother. He has connections everywhere. Banks, government offices, media outlets. He can make your life very difficult if you don't back down. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who actually understands how this world works. Her voice softened slightly, taking on the manipulative tone I'd come to recognize. It's not too late to fix this. Blackstone is willing to buy those properties from you at above market value. You could walk away with a profit and everyone wins. Everyone except the 37 families who would lose their homes. Those people will find other places to live, Vivienne said dismissively. They always do. But if you keep fighting this, you're going to lose everything you've built. Your reputation, your new position at the college, your little newspaper column. All of it will disappear when Blackstone is finished with you. I thought about Rebecca's warnings. about the Martinez family who'd been harassed for 2 years. I thought about my peaceful life in Elmwood Park, my book club friends, the sense of purpose I'd finally found. All of it could indeed disappear if I continued down this path. But then I thought about Jennifer Walsh's neighbor, the elderly woman who'd lived in Riverside for 40 years and couldn't afford to relocate. I thought about the children who walked to school through those familiar streets, the small businesses that served the community, the networks of mutual support that would be shattered if Blackstone's plan succeeded. "No," I said simply. "No?" Vivienne's voice rose in disbelief. "Mother, you're not listening to me. This isn't a game. Harrison Blackstone will destroy you." "Then I guess we'll see how much destruction one old woman can survive." The confrontation I'd been dreading came 3 days later, but not in the form I'd expected. Instead of legal papers or media attacks, it came as a carefully orchestrated ambush at the monthly Millbrook City Council meeting. I'd planned to attend anyway. The Riverside development was on the agenda for discussion, but I hadn't expected to walk into a room packed with what were obviously Blackstone's supporters. Men in expensive suits who didn't live anywhere near Riverside, women with perfect hair and designer handbags who'd never set foot in the neighborhood they were supposedly concerned about. Harrison Blackstone himself sat in the front row, and I finally got my first good look at the man I'd been fighting. He was smaller than I'd imagined, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bland handsomeness that money could buy. But his eyes were calculating, cold, and when they fixed on me as I entered the council chambers, I felt the full weight of his malice. The public comment period began with a parade of Blackstone's people. They spoke passionately about the need for economic development, about bringing quality housing to Millbrook, about the dangers of allowing outside agitators to block progress. Several of them mentioned me by name, questioning my motives and suggesting that my opposition was based on personal grudges rather than legitimate community concerns. Then came the surprise witness. "I'd like to call on Mrs. Vivienne Worthington to share her perspective on this matter," announced Councilmember David Morrison, who I now realized must be in Blackstone's pocket. My daughter stood up from a seat I hadn't noticed her occupying, dressed in her most conservative business suit, every inch the respectable young matron. As she walked to the podium, I felt something inside me wither and die. "Thank you, Councilman Morrison," she began, her voice carrying perfectly to every corner of the packed room. "I'm here tonight because I feel it's important for you to understand the full context of the opposition to Mr. Blackstone's development project." She looked directly at me as she continued. "My mother, Dorothy Clearwater, has been deliberately misleading this community about her background, her motives, and her resources. For years, she allowed people to believe she was a struggling working-class woman, when in fact, she possessed significant wealth that she chose to hide from her own family." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw several of my book club friends in the audience, their faces showing shock and confusion. "This pattern of deception," Vivienne continued, "calls into question everything about her current campaign against the Riverside development. Is this really about protecting families? Or is it about a wealthy woman's personal vendetta against a successful businessman? Is this about community welfare? Or is it about someone who's been playing elaborate games with people's lives for her own amusement?" The words were carefully chosen, technically truthful, but deliberately misleading. She made my years of modest living sound like a cruel joke played on unsuspecting victims, my current advocacy like the whim of a bored rich woman. "My mother has the financial resources to purchase property anywhere she wants," Vivienne concluded. "The families in Riverside have limited options. Yet she's willing to manipulate those families' fears and use their children as pawns in her personal conflict with Mr. Blackstone. I ask you to consider who really has the power in this situation and who's really being exploited." The applause that followed was thunderous. Blackstone's supporters cheered as if they'd just witnessed a great moral victory, while the actual Riverside residents who'd come to speak in support of our foundation looked stunned and betrayed. When it was my turn to speak, the room fell silent. I walked to the podium feeling every eye in the chamber weighing and judging me. My prepared remarks about community preservation and affordable housing suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of my daughter's character assassination. "My name is Dorothy Clearwater," I began, "and everything my daughter just told you is true." The admission sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. I did hide my financial resources from my family and community for 15 years. I did make choices that seem inexplicable to people who've never lived with the burden of significant wealth. And yes, I am a rich woman fighting to protect poor families from displacement. I paused, looking out at the faces before me. Some hostile, some curious, some disappointed. What my daughter didn't tell you is why I made those choices. She didn't tell you about the 15 years I spent working alongside the people you want to displace, learning their stories, understanding their struggles. She didn't tell you about the trust fund I built for her that she'll never see, because she tried to ship me off to an assisted living facility when I became inconvenient to her social climbing. Now it was Vivienne's turn to look shocked. I'd never publicly discussed the trust fund before. "But most importantly," I continued, "she didn't tell you that this isn't about my personal conflict with Mr. Blackstone or my complicated relationship with my daughter. This is about 37 families who deserve the same right to stable housing that every person in this room takes for granted." I turned to address Harrison Blackstone directly. "Mr. Blackstone, you've tried to turn this into a story about my character, my honesty, my motives. But the only character that matters here is yours. You're a wealthy man trying to make more money by displacing working families. I'm a wealthy woman trying to stop you. The difference is that I'm not pretending this is about anything other than basic human decency." The room erupted. Blackstone's supporters shouted objections, while Riverside residents applauded and cheered. Councilman Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But I wasn't finished. "Mr. Blackstone," I said, raising my voice above the chaos, "you wanted a fight with me? You've got one. But understand this. I have more money than you think, more allies than you know, and more determination than you can imagine. This community is under my protection now, and I don't back down from bullies." As I walked back to my seat through the tumultuous crowd, I caught sight of Vivienne near the exit. Our eyes met for a moment across the chaos, and I saw something in her expression that might have been regret, or fear, or simply the recognition that she'd just escalated a conflict beyond anything she'd intended. The battle lines were now drawn in the starkest possible terms. Harrison Blackstone had my daughter as an ally and the full weight of his political and financial machine behind him. But I had something he didn't expect: a lifetime of anger at being underestimated, and enough money to make that anger very expensive for him. The aftermath of the city council meeting was unlike anything I could have imagined. Within 24 hours, my confrontation with Harrison Blackstone had gone viral on social media, been picked up by regional news outlets, and turned me into an unlikely symbol of resistance against corporate gentrification. The video of my speech, particularly the moment I told Blackstone he'd picked a fight with the wrong woman, had been shared thousands of times across platforms I'd never even heard of. But viral fame, I quickly discovered, was a double-edged sword. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and podcast hosts who wanted to tell the story of the secret millionaire janitor taking on big development. My mailbox overflowed with letters from supporters across the country sharing their own stories of displacement and corporate bullying. The Millbrook Community Preservation Foundation's website crashed twice from the volume of traffic and donation attempts. More importantly, the story had awakened something in Millbrook itself. Residents who'd never attended a city council meeting before were suddenly organizing, researching Blackstone's other projects, and demanding transparency in local government. The Riverside neighborhood, which had been facing displacement and isolation, suddenly found itself at the center of a broader movement for affordable housing and community preservation. "Dorothy," Rebecca said, sliding a thick folder across her desk during our emergency meeting 3 days after the council confrontation, I've been practicing law for 22 years and I've never seen anything like this response. We have offers of pro bono legal support from firms in 3 states. A team of investigative journalists offering to dig into Blackstone's business practices, and enough donated funds to expand our operations beyond anything we originally imagined. I opened the folder to find page after page of volunteer applications, donation pledges, and offers of professional services. There were architects willing to redesign community spaces, social workers offering to help displaced families, accountants ready to audit Blackstone's tax records, and urban planners eager to develop alternative development proposals. "This is incredible," I said, scanning through the documents. "But Rebecca, I have to ask, is this sustainable? Once the media attention dies down, will these people still be here?" "Some will, some won't," she admitted. "But Dorothy, you've done something that community organizers dream about. You've turned a local housing issue into a national conversation about wealth, power, and corporate responsibility. Even if half these supporters disappear next month, we'll still have more resources than we ever imagined possible." She was right, but the attention also meant scrutiny I wasn't entirely prepared for. Financial reporters were analyzing my investment portfolio, tax records were being requested through Freedom of Information Acts, and every aspect of my past 15 years was being dissected by people with various agendas. The most painful analysis came from an unexpected source. That Thursday, Harrison's soccer game was featured in the local newspaper's sports section, not because of his athletic achievements, but because reporters had tracked down my grandsons to ask them about their secret millionaire grandmother. The article included a photo of Harrison in his team uniform, looking confused and overwhelmed by the adult questions being thrust at him. "Mom," Jennifer Walsh said when she called me that evening, "I just wanted you to know that some of us from the college are planning to create a buffer around your grandsons. We've organized with their school to make sure reporters can't get access to them on campus, and we're taking turns monitoring their soccer games to keep media away." The gesture of protection from my former colleagues touched me deeply, but it also highlighted the cost of my newfound public profile. My grandsons, innocent children who'd already lost their grandmother to their mother's pride, were now being harassed by journalists hungry for a human interest angle. But it was the call I received from an unexpected ally that changed everything. "Mrs. Clearwater, this is Mayor Patricia Williams. I wonder if we could meet privately to discuss the Riverside situation." I'd been surprised when Mayor Williams hadn't spoken at the city council meeting, given the high-profile nature of the conflict. She'd maintained an official neutrality that seemed suspicious, considering her usual close relationship with the business community. We met the next morning at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from the media circus that had surrounded my usual haunts. Mayor Williams was a woman in her late 50s, who'd built her political career on pragmatic compromise and careful relationship management. She looked tired, older than her years, when she slid into the booth across from me. "Dorothy," she began without preamble, "I need to tell you something that I probably should have said months ago. Harrison Blackstone has been pressuring my office to expedite the Riverside project approval since last spring. He's threatened to pull his other development projects from Millbrook if we don't cooperate, and he's made it clear that my political future depends on keeping him happy." The admission surprised me. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because what happened at that council meeting changed something for me. Watching your daughter attack you in public, seeing Blackstone's people cheer while families faced losing their homes, it reminded me why I went into politics in the first place." She paused, stirring her coffee nervously. "And because I have information you need to know." She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to me. "Blackstone's financing for the Riverside project is shakier than he's let on. He's borrowed heavily against his other properties to fund this development, and his investors are getting nervous about the delays and bad publicity. If the project doesn't move forward in the next 60 days, his entire company could face serious financial difficulties." I opened the envelope to find copies of loan documents, investor agreements, and financial projections that painted a very different picture of Harrison Blackstone's empire than the one he presented publicly. "How did you get these?" I asked. "Let's just say that not everyone in Blackstone's organization is as loyal as he thinks they are. Some of his own staff are disgusted by his tactics, especially after they saw how he manipulated your daughter into attacking you publicly." This was the opening Rebecca and I had been hoping for, proof that Blackstone was more vulnerable than he appeared. But Mayor Williams wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said. "I've been in touch with mayors from other cities where Blackstone has operated. The pattern is always the same. He targets working-class neighborhoods, uses political pressure and intimidation to fast-track approvals, displaces long-time residents, then builds luxury housing that sits half-empty because it's priced beyond what local markets can sustain." She handed me another folder. These are documented cases from Cedar Falls, Riverside Park, and New Harbor. In every instance, his developments have ultimately failed economically while destroying established communities. He's not a successful businessman, Dorothy. He's a predator who's been getting away with community destruction because no one with your resources has ever been willing to fight him. The information was devastating for Blackstone, but it also revealed the scope of damage he'd already caused in other communities. Hundreds of families displaced, dozens of small businesses destroyed, entire neighborhoods gentrified beyond recognition, all to feed one man's ego and greed. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Public support when I announced the city's withdrawal from the Riverside project approvals, and help weathering the political storm that's coming when Blackstone realizes he's lost his official backing." That afternoon, I called a press conference, my first as the public face of the Millbrook Community Preservation Foundation. The turnout was enormous. Local media, regional television stations, national correspondents who'd driven up from the Capitol, and dozens of community supporters who'd been following the story. Standing at the podium in the community college's main auditorium, the same building where I'd spent years working night shifts in anonymity, I felt the weight of transformation that had brought me to this moment. 2 months ago, I began, I was a janitor whose daughter was ashamed of her. Today, I'm a woman whose community has given her the opportunity to fight for families who deserve the same security and dignity that wealth has always provided for people like me. I outlined the evidence Mayor Williams had provided, the pattern of destruction Blackstone had left in other communities, and the financial vulnerabilities that made him more desperate than dangerous. Harrison Blackstone has spent the past week trying to make this story about my character, my honesty, my fitness, to represent this community's interests. But this was never about me. This is about whether we're going to let one man's greed destroy neighborhoods that have taken generations to build. I paused, looking out at the crowd, familiar faces from the book club, former colleagues from my janitorial days, residents of Riverside clutching their children's hands, and new allies who'd come from across the region to support our cause. "I want to be clear about something," I continued. "I am a wealthy woman. I could have remained invisible, could have written checks to charity, and felt good about my philanthropy while staying safely removed from the messy work of actual change. But I learned something important from my years of hiding. Silence in the face of injustice isn't humility, it's complicity." The applause was thunderous, but I wasn't finished. "So yes, Mr. Blackstone, I have more money than you expected, more allies than you counted on, and more determination than you can break. But more importantly, I have something you'll never understand, the backing of a community that knows the difference between wealth used for exploitation and wealth used for protection." That evening, as I sat in my study reviewing the day's events, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Harrison Blackstone's office number. "Mrs. Clearwater." His voice was controlled but strained. "I think it's time we had a direct conversation." "I'm listening." "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for those Riverside properties. Significantly above market value, with additional compensation for your advocacy efforts." "Not interested." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Clearwater, I don't think you understand the forces you're dealing with. This goes beyond just me and my company. There are larger interests at stake here." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackstone?" "I'm offering you one final opportunity to resolve this matter professionally before it becomes unpleasant for everyone involved." I thought about my grandsons, about the media attention that was already affecting their lives. I thought about the political and financial pressure that would undoubtedly intensify if I continued this fight. I thought about how easy it would be to take his money, claim victory, and return to my quiet life in Elmwood Park. Then I thought about Jennifer Walsh's elderly neighbor, about the children who'd grown up playing in Riverside streets, about the pattern of destruction Blackstone had left in other communities. "Mr. Blackstone," I said clearly, "go to hell." The silence that followed was profound. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. "You have no idea what you've just brought down on yourself." "Then I guess we'll both find out together." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the life I'd built on careful deception and the new life I was building on radical honesty. Whatever came next, whatever price I'd have to pay for taking on a man like Harrison Blackstone, I knew I'd finally become the person I was meant to be. The woman who'd spent 15 years hiding her light under a bushel had finally learned to shine. 3 months after Harrison Blackstone's final threat, his retaliation had proven to be more bark than bite. His promised campaign of destruction had amounted to little more than a series of frivolous lawsuits that Rebecca Sterling dismantled with surgical precision, a few negative articles in business publications that no one in Millbrook read, and some ineffectual pressure on local officials who'd already distanced themselves from his sinking ship. The man who'd seemed so formidable in the council chambers had revealed himself to be exactly what Mayor Williams had suggested, a predator who relied on intimidation and political connections rather than genuine strength. When faced with sustained resistance from someone with equal financial resources and superior community support, he'd folded like a house of cards. By December, Blackstone Industries had quietly withdrawn from all planned Millbrook developments and moved their operations to a more welcoming jurisdiction 3 counties over. The Riverside neighborhood was safe, and my foundation had become a permanent fixture in the community's landscape. But my real victory wasn't in defeating Harrison Blackstone. It was in the life I'd built in the wake of that battle. Standing in the newly renovated community center that had once been a neglected property in Riverside, I watched as Jennifer Walsh's 8-year-old daughter practiced violin with the after-school music program we'd established. The same building now housed a free health clinic, a computer lab for job training, a community kitchen where neighbors shared meals, and meeting spaces for the dozen grassroots organizations that had sprouted from our initial organizing efforts. Mrs. Dorothy called Maria Santos, a young mother whose family had been among those facing displacement. "Could you come settle an argument? My teenage son insists that your book club meetings are just an excuse for troublemakers to plan their next revolution." I laughed, following her to the corner where our expanded book club now met twice weekly. What had started as 6 women discussing literature in the library had grown into a 30-person intergenerational group that tackled everything from historical fiction to urban planning texts. Tonight we were discussing a memoir about community organizing in the 1960s, and the parallels to our own recent experiences had generated passionate debate. "Miguel might not be entirely wrong," I admitted to Maria as we approached the group. "Half our discussions these days do seem to end with someone proposing a new initiative or planning a protest." It was true. The book club had become an unofficial think tank for community development, the place where ideas were born, refined, and turned into action. Our discussions of housing policy had led to a successful campaign for inclusionary zoning. A conversation about environmental justice had spawned a community garden project that now supplied fresh produce to 3 local food pantries. Even our poetry nights somehow produced concrete plans for improving sidewalk accessibility and expanding public transit. "Dorothy," called out Patricia from across the room, We need your input on the scholarship program proposal. The scholarship program was my latest project, using a portion of my investment returns to fund college education for students from working-class families in Millbrook. Unlike the traditional merit-based scholarships that typically went to students who already had advantages, ours focused on supporting young people who demonstrated resilience, community commitment, and potential despite facing significant obstacles. "How many applications are we up to now?" I asked, settling into the circle of mismatched chairs that had become our regular formation. 237, said Janet, who'd become our unofficial coordinator, and that's just for the first year. Word is spreading faster than we expected. The number was both thrilling and daunting. I'd originally budgeted for 20 scholarships, but the overwhelming response had forced me to reconsider the scope of what was possible. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said, pulling out the notes I'd been working on all week. "Instead of limiting ourselves to a fixed number, what if we set up the program to be sustainable long-term? I can establish a larger endowment fund, bring in other donors, maybe even create pathways for scholarship recipients to give back to future students." "You mean build something that could outlast all of us," Susan said thoughtfully. "Something that becomes part of the community's permanent infrastructure." Exactly. I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, not just what I leave behind financially, but what kind of systems I help create for future generations. The conversation that followed was exactly the kind that would have terrified the old Dorothy, the one who'd spent 15 years hiding her capabilities and avoiding attention. We talked about establishing an educational foundation, creating partnerships with local colleges, developing mentorship programs that connected scholarship recipients with successful professionals in their fields of interest. As the evening wound down and people began gathering their belongings, Clara approached me with the kind of expression that meant she had something serious on her mind. "Dorothy, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. Walk with me?" We stepped outside into the crisp December air, our breath visible in small clouds as we strolled through the neighborhood that had become the center of my new life. The streets were quieter now, but not empty. Families finishing dinner, teenagers walking home from basketball practice at the community center, elderly residents taking evening walks on sidewalks that our foundation had recently repaired and improved. "I've been watching you these past few months," Clara said, "and I see someone who's found her purpose. But I also see someone who's carrying a sadness that she doesn't talk about." I knew immediately what she meant, though I'd been avoiding thinking about it directly. "My grandsons, Harrison and Preston. You've been helping dozens of children through your scholarship program and community work, but you haven't seen your own grandsons in 4 months." The pain of it was sharp and constant, like a physical wound that wouldn't heal. In all my planning for confronting Harrison Blackstone, in all my preparation for the consequences of going public with my wealth and values, I hadn't fully prepared for the cost of losing access to the 2 children who'd been the light of my life. "Vivienne has made it clear that my presence in their lives is unwelcome," I said quietly. "She's convinced that my newfound notoriety makes me a bad influence, that exposure to my quote-prout politics would somehow damage their development." "And you believe that?" I considered the question as we walked. "I believe that Harrison and Preston deserve to grow up without being caught in the middle of adult conflicts they can't understand. I believe that forcing a relationship that their mother is actively sabotaging would hurt them more than help them. But I also believe that someday they'll be old enough to make their own choices about relationships. And when that day comes, I want to be someone they can be proud to know." Clara stopped walking and turned to face me. "Dorothy, you've become someone that everyone who knows you can be proud to know. You've used your resources to protect vulnerable families. You've stood up to bullies in positions of power. You've created opportunities for young people to build better lives. If Harrison and Preston can't see you now, that's their mother's failure, not yours." Her words were comforting, but they didn't fill the Harrison and Preston-shaped hole in my heart. Still, I'd learned something important in the months since our family had fractured. Love didn't have to be reciprocated to be meaningful, and family could be chosen as well as inherited. The next week brought an unexpected gift. I was at home, reviewing applications for our winter scholarship round, when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw a small figure bundled in a winter coat, shifting nervously from foot to foot on my front porch. I opened the door to find Harrison, now 9 years old and taller than I remembered, holding a manila envelope and looking like he might bolt at any moment. "Harrison?" I could barely breathe. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "I rode my bike," he said, as if that explained everything. "Mom doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at soccer practice, but I told Coach I was sick so I could come see you." I knelt down to his level, fighting the urge to sweep him into my arms. "How did you find my address?" "I looked it up online. There were lots of articles about you." He held out the envelope. "I brought you something." Inside were drawings, dozens of them, apparently created over months, pictures of the three of us having picnics, building snowmen, reading books together. At the bottom of each drawing, in his careful 9-year-old handwriting, were notes. "I miss you, Grandma Dorothy. I hope you're not mad at me. Mom says you're too busy saving the world to visit us." "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, my eyes filling with tears. "I'm not too busy for you. I could never be too busy for you." "Then why don't you come see us anymore?" How do you explain adult conflicts to a child? How do you tell a 9-year-old that his mother has chosen social standing over family relationships, that his grandmother's love has been deemed politically inconvenient? "Harrison, your mom and I disagree about some important things. She thinks it's better if I stay away for a while, so you and Preston don't get caught in the middle of grown-up problems." "But I want to be in the middle," he said, with the fierce certainty that only children possess. "I want to hear about your book club and your community center and all the kids you're helping go to college. Preston does too, even though he's too scared to say it." I looked at this boy who'd inherited his mother's determination but seemed to have found a moral compass she'd never developed, and I made a decision that would have consequences I couldn't predict. "Harrison, I want you to know that no matter what happens between your mom and me, I will always love you and Preston. And when you're old enough to make your own choices about relationships, I'll be here." How old is old enough? I considered the question seriously. "I think you're probably old enough right now to understand that families can love each other even when they disagree. And you're definitely old enough to know that I'm proud of you for riding your bike across town to tell me you miss me." He grinned, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since he'd arrived. "Can I come back sometime, when Mom's not looking?" "Harrison, I don't want you to lie to your mother or sneak around, but I want you to know that my door is always open to you, whenever you're ready to walk through it." That evening, I added a new section to my will, a trust fund for Harrison and Preston that would become available when they turned 18, along with a letter explaining my choices, my values, and my hopes for their futures. Unlike the trust fund I'd canceled for their mother, this one came with no strings attached, no expectations, beyond the hope that they'd use their resources to make the world a little better than they'd found it. As I sealed the envelope containing their letters, I realized that I'd finally learned the difference between loving someone and trying to control them. The old Dorothy had thought she could teach values through deception and manipulation. The new Dorothy understood that the best gift you could give someone was the freedom to become who they were meant to be, supported by resources and unconditional love. Whether Harrison and Preston would choose to be part of my life remained to be seen, but I'd given them everything I could: financial security, moral example, and the knowledge that their grandmother was someone who fought for what she believed in. The rest was up to them. 2 years after Harrison's secret visit to my house, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Community Development, preparing to deliver the keynote address that would close the most transformative chapter of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. A woman who'd spent 15 years trying to be invisible was now being celebrated as a national model for grassroots organizing and authentic philanthropy. But the real transformation wasn't in my public recognition. It was in the letter I'd received 3 days earlier, written in the careful cursive of an 11-year-old boy who decided he was old enough to make his own choices about family relationships. "Dear Grandma Dorothy," Harrison had written, "Mom says I shouldn't write to you, but I'm doing it anyway because Preston and I have been talking, and we think you should know some things. First, we've been reading about you online. Mom doesn't know, and we think what you're doing is really cool. Second, we miss you every day, and we don't understand why helping people is supposed to be bad. Third, Preston wants to come see you too, but he's scared Mom will find out. Can you maybe come to my soccer game on Saturday? I play at 2 p.m. at Millbrook Fields. You don't have to talk to Mom if you don't want to. We just want to see you." I had read that letter dozens of times, each reading confirming what I'd suspected since his first secret visit. My grandsons were developing their own moral compasses, independent of their mother's influence. They were becoming exactly the kind of young people I'd hoped to raise when I'd started this whole journey 15 years ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at an audience of community organizers, philanthropists, social workers, and activists from across the country. "I want to tell you about the most expensive lesson I ever learned. It cost me 15 years of authentic relationships, a daughter's respect, and nearly $2 million in a canceled trust fund. But it taught me something invaluable about the difference between charity and justice, between hiding your light and letting it shine." The auditorium was completely silent as I shared my story, not just the public version that had made me famous, but the whole truth about deception, family dysfunction, and the unexpected consequences of well-intentioned lies. For 15 years, I thought I was teaching humility by pretending to be poor. Instead, I was teaching my daughter that a person's value was determined by their economic status. I thought I was modeling good work ethic by taking a janitorial job I didn't need. Instead, I was modeling dishonesty and self-deception. I paused, meeting the eyes of people in the audience who were nodding in recognition of their own struggles with authenticity and purpose. The hardest truth I had to face was that my daughter's shame about my supposed poverty revealed something I'd accidentally taught her, that there was something shameful about honest work, something embarrassing about modest living, something to apologize for in choosing substance over status. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "Mrs. Clearwater, how do you reconcile your financial privilege with your advocacy for working-class families? Aren't you just another wealthy person trying to salve their conscience through charity?" It was the question I'd been asked hundreds of times, and I'd finally developed an answer that felt honest, rather than defensive. "That's exactly what I would be if I'd stayed hidden behind my privilege," I said. "But there's a difference between charity, giving from a safe distance to make yourself feel better, and solidarity, which requires you to risk something real. When I bought those properties in Riverside, I didn't just risk money. I risked my reputation, my privacy, my family relationships, and my comfortable anonymity. That's what moved me from charity to justice work." After my speech, during the networking reception, I was approached by a young woman who looked familiar but whom I couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Clearwater? I'm Elena Martinez, Jennifer Walsh's daughter, from the community college?" The recognition hit me immediately. Elena had been about 16 when I'd known her as a night janitor, a quiet teenager who'd sometimes come to the college with her mother when childcare fell through. Now she was clearly in her early 20s, professionally dressed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose. "Elena? My goodness, you've grown up. How's your mother?" "She's wonderful. Still working at the college, actually, but now she's in charge of the community outreach program you helped establish." Elena smiled. "I wanted to thank you for something you probably don't even remember. When I was 16, you caught me crying in the campus library one night when I was there with Mom. You sat with me for an hour and helped me with my college application essay." I did remember. A late night in November. A young woman overwhelmed by the complexity of applying for financial aid and college admission without family guidance. "You told me that intelligence and determination weren't privileges reserved for wealthy kids," Elena continued. You said I belonged in college just as much as anyone whose parents could afford to pay full tuition. That conversation changed my life. What are you doing now? I asked. I just graduated from law school. I'm starting work at a legal aid clinic next month, specializing in housing rights and tenant advocacy. I'm going to do what you do, but from inside the legal system. The pride I felt in that moment was deeper than anything I'd experienced from my own achievements. This young woman, who'd grown up watching her mother work night shifts to support their family, had built a career around protecting other families from displacement and exploitation. She was living proof that the most meaningful legacy wasn't money. It was the inspiration to use whatever power you had to protect those who had less. The conference ended on Sunday, and I flew home to Millbrook with a new sense of clarity about what came next. My work with the foundation would continue, but I was ready to step back from the public spotlight and focus on the quieter, more sustainable work of building systems that could outlast any individual personality. Saturday afternoon found me sitting in the bleachers at Millbrook Fields, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses in a probably futile attempt to avoid recognition. Harrison had grown taller, his movements on the soccer field more coordinated and confident than I remembered. When he scored a goal in the second half, he looked directly at the stands and waved, not to his parents on the opposite side, but to me. After the game, as families gathered their children and equipment, Harrison approached the fence that separated the field from the spectator area. Preston, now 8 and clearly nervous, followed a few steps behind. "Grandma Dorothy," Harrison said quietly, "we need to talk to you about something." I looked around for Vivienne, spotting her near the parking lot in animated conversation with other parents, apparently unaware of her son's current location. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Mom says you're never coming back, that you chose your politics over your family. But Preston and I have been talking, and we don't think that's true." Preston, gathering courage, stepped forward. "We think Mom chose her reputation over her family, and she's trying to make it sound like it was your fault." The wisdom in these children's voices stopped me cold. At 8 and 11, they'd cut through years of adult manipulation and arrived at a truth that many grown-ups couldn't see. "What do you want to do about that?" I asked carefully. Harrison and Preston exchanged a look that spoke of long conversations and shared decisions. "We want to keep seeing you," Harrison said, "even if Mom doesn't like it. Even if we have to meet in secret for a while." "We're not choosing sides," Preston added quickly. "We love Mom. But we love you too, and we don't think love should have rules about politics." Standing there by that soccer field, looking at these two boys who'd somehow learned to separate love from control, acceptance from approval, family loyalty from blind obedience, I understood that the most important lesson of this entire journey wasn't the one I'd tried to teach. It was the one they'd taught me, that authentic relationships require the courage to be honest about who you are, even when that honesty disappoints people you love. "Boys," I said, "I want you to understand something important. Whatever happens between your mother and me, whatever choices you make about our relationship, I will always be proud of who you're becoming. You're both developing something that can't be bought or inherited. Integrity. That's worth more than any trust fund I could ever leave you." Harrison grinned. "Speaking of trust funds, we know about those too. We looked up your will online. Did you know it's public record?" I laughed, despite myself. "What do you think about that?" "We think," Preston said solemnly, "that by the time we're 18, we'll probably have learned enough from watching you to use that money the right way." As I walked back to my car, leaving my grandsons to return to their mother's orbit for now, I felt something I'd never expected to feel at the end of this long, painful, transformative journey: complete peace. I'd spent 15 years trying to teach values through deception and control. I'd lost a daughter to her own pride and social ambitions. I'd gained national recognition for work I'd never intended to make public. I'd discovered that authenticity was both more costly and more rewarding than I'd ever imagined. But most importantly, I'd learned that the best gift you can give someone isn't money or protection or even love. It's the example of a life lived with integrity, courage, and genuine care for others. Whether Vivienne would ever understand that lesson remained to be seen. But Harrison and Preston were already living it, and that was legacy enough for any grandmother. The woman who'd once hidden in shame behind a janitor's uniform had finally learned to stand tall in her own power. And the light she'd kept hidden for so long was now illuminating the path forward for the next generation. Some stories end with reconciliation. Others end with transformation. Mine ended with the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to apologize for becoming who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.